Hi, it's Dr. Parikh, and I'm talking about APA 7th edition. So we'll start with some audiovisual. So we've got two different versions of the 6th edition. So the blue book is the full edition, or the full manual. The red book is just the concise rules. If you have a solid color-ish manual, it's probably old. I think all of the new ones are going with like this color block thing. This is the paperback. It's the cheapest. You can also get a hardback. I'm not really sure who wants those. There's also a really nifty spiral bound version that has tabs along the side. Those are really nice. Now, it's more expensive than the previous one. It's full color, so even this is more expensive. Do not buy the old edition. If you don't want to buy the new edition, just use copies in libraries or other places. But there are differences, particularly in the sorts of things that you're most likely to need to look at. So make sure you've got the 7th edition. If you don't, you find it somewhere, use other resources. If you watch a lot of my videos, here's a nifty little way to know which edition I'm using. If I've got blue glasses, it's the 7th edition. If I've got purple glasses that my child helpfully broke last fall, it means that I'm still working from the 6th edition. So I think that's all you need my face for, and I will go, I'll focus the rest of the video looking at the screens. So the first thing we'll do, we're going to go through and look at the side-by-side differences of a paper. This is my template for just the literature review, so it's not going to show all the formatting. This is what, for our undergrad psych program, students most likely use. This is what you use for most of your classes. So over here on the right is the old edition. Here on the left is the new edition. The good news is almost all of the changes for the new edition, I think, are the sorts of things students messed up most anyway. And I messed up. It's the things I had to look up the most often. So they got rid of the word running head in the top, so you don't have to do this different first page. I even unchecked it here. So you still have a running head, so a shorter version of your article, or of your manuscript, so that if it were to be published in a book or a journal, it's what they would put at the top to make it easier to find. The title still goes there, but now the title is bolded, so there's more of bolding things that feel like they should be important. And then there's an extra space, and they've changed a little bit about the way you say where you're writing from. So they have you include your department or your school. So for Caldwell, we're in the School of Psychology and Counseling. And we don't have a department underneath that. We're just the school, Caldwell University. So it's nice because it's more specific. And if you have multiple authors, I believe they've changed the way that goes, but I would have to look. And I think they've gotten a little more clear about how high they want it on the page. Now there's a student version that has extra information, almost like what you would get on an MLA paper that you turn in. I'm not using that because, for one, I think it just adds confusion about what's APA and what's MLA, but also my whole reason for using this is because it's what's standard for publication. So I'm preparing all my students in case they want to go on to publish, to write in graduate school, so it just seems silly to me to have a separate style. So if you see anything about professional versus student style, the main difference is here in this title page, as far as I can tell, and I just am using the professional. So here, going on to the abstract, let me get out of the header. So again, you're bolding things that students tended to want to bold anyway. So the word abstract still gets bolded now. Everything else is still the same. The keywords should still be the same. Now I'm panicking and I want to check. Let me pull up the camera again. Hi. There we go. So the new edition, I think, has more clear sample things. And so when I'm not sure how to do things, I just look at the sample. And yep, keywords is still italicized and indented with a colon. The words themselves are not italicized, just the word keywords. And the abstract is not indented. I'm not entirely sure why. Those are still sort of unusual formatting choices compared to everything else. But that's the way it is. They've solved a lot of the things that felt so unusual before. So you put your title at the top again over here, and now the title is bolded. So these beginnings of different sections of the paper are now bolded. And again, that's something that students often made mistakes on. The headings have changed a little bit. So the first two levels, so APA goes level 1, level 2. So your title doesn't count. So literature review is level 1, and then you would put in some sort of heading to describe what this section, this subsection is about. That's called level 2. Those two didn't change. I'll show you over here in the method section is the main place I have students use level 3. It used to be like indented with a period and then the sentence would just continue, but they've introduced a new level. And again, no, that's not where I want it. One thing I really like about one of their choices here is they have very helpful guides in the front cover. So they have the level headings, and then they also have a guide to the citations, which I'll talk about later. And I really appreciate it because the level headings is the thing that throws me the most off. It just looks so wrong to me. And so I have to refer to it a lot to make sure that I'm correcting it and making, that I'm making my templates correctly, and that if I'm correcting someone's paper, I'm not taking off points for them doing it the right way. So I think that's very helpful. So the headings structure has changed a little bit, but only for level 3 and below. So structurally, we get down to the reference list, and the word references is now bold, just like abstract and the title of your main body. So a few things changed with the reference list. I don't have any here that are more than 7, I think. I always had to look these numbers up. But now up to 20 authors, you list everybody's name. So you may have some references that are really, really long now, but you don't have to remember the rules as much. And you're much less likely to have to actually look up that rule and follow it. The other big difference is they're emphasizing DOIs more, and they really want to move toward a link style, which they've said on their blog is the preferred method for a while. So I've been having students do the link style, and now it is the required style for doing a DOI. And you can actually check it. I don't know if these are live links, but if you do it correctly, it should actually take you to the journal's main page. Now that's in some ways not as convenient because you have to log into the journal to read it that way. Whereas usually your university library will give you a permalink that it kind of looks like it might be a DOI link, but it's not. You need a DOI that takes you to the general page because someone outside your library sees absolutely nothing with a library link outside of your university. But everything else is pretty much the same. They've added a lot more guidelines of how to handle unique situations, like government reports, and they've also added a lot of new technology. So how do you cite a YouTube video? I'm creating my syllabi and I use that a lot, or a podcast, even down to how do you cite a tweet or a comment on a blog post. So there's a lot more flexibility or a lot more options set up in the manual. That is most of the overall style changes. Let's see, I think I have space to bring my face up again, just so I believe in trying to be a little expressive as I'm looking at things. So this document I will happily send to anyone who wants it, and it's just what I've put together, what I see going through and looking at the changes. Let me try to zoom in on this a little bit so that it can be seen a little better on the video. How big is, yeah, I think that's good. And then I'll just move my face over a little bit. So most of it we've already talked about. They've given more clarity on where the title goes. Oh, yeah, when you're posting links to journal articles, you take out the word retrieved from. There used to be things, spaces around after periods is a thing, and now they've said single space, but they said unless the journal or the instructor requires otherwise. So if you're an instructor, you still have the flexibility to say, nope, I really want there to be a single space. There are more fonts that are acceptable. I, as a professor, I'm just going to stick with Times New Roman because it's this thing when you read so many papers, you get used to it looking a certain way, and it just becomes easier for you to read. It starts to get hard to read it other ways. But for some people with different, just different brains, some fonts are easier to process. So that's part of why they gave more flexibility, because for some people, Times New Roman is more difficult to read than other fonts might be. Tables and figures, the classes I teach, I don't deal with a lot of tables and figures, but the formatting has been kind of difficult to navigate. They've tried to make it a little more clear and more similar between tables and figures. And they used to say it has to go at the very end. Now they're a little more flexible and say you can stick it in where it makes sense, which is how it works when you read it. And really, it's adapting more and more to the fact that we write on computers now. This system started with typewritten, which is just a different neat thing to deal with. So again, the alternate student paper format. Everyone I've talked to is not going to be. Oh yeah, sorry, there were changes from previous drafts and I got confused, but this is right. So if you're at Caldwell's Psych and Counseling programs, we've all kind of agreed that we want to keep with the professional format, and everyone else I've talked to has said that that's what they're planning to do for their classes also. So if you're not sure, check. So new heading structure, and this is more clear in that little front cover for the manual, but just to have this. So new citation and reference rules. This is where there is a big, big change. And this is where, so the table here really, I think, helps, the table down here. It's not focusing quite clearly enough for you to read, perhaps, but they do have a table that makes it nicer. And essentially, what they're saying is that there's one way to do it in parentheses, so just at the end of the sentence, and there's a way to do it if you're using the names as part of the sentence, which they call a narrative citation. And so now, before, if you had one or two authors, you did the same thing pretty much every time. But if you had three or more authors, it could get really sticky. But they've simplified it quite a bit. 3 or more authors, doesn't matter how many, are just first author et al. Every single time, which makes life a lot easier. In references, include the issue number every time. I had students do that just because I thought the rule was probably a little confusing, but that's a formal thing to say now. If an issue number exists, use it in the citation. Again, there's a ton more examples and clarifications, but if you have a problem that's not covered in the manual, I highly recommend the APA style blog. I just start with Googling for things, and if the APA style blog comes up, that's my first hit. A lot of libraries also have Q&A pages where they research and answer things, and they've just added a lot more things. APA manual, so this is an awfully big book for just telling you how to format your paper, because it tells you a lot more than that. It includes grammar standards. It talks a lot about concise writing, which I think is something that's difficult to know how to do without seeing examples. So I think the examples it has for that are very valuable. It's also why when I work with students, I often try to help them rewrite or sometimes I'll even try to give them 2 or 3 different ways that they could say something so they can see how different formats change things. So when you're writing, particularly when you're writing about people, which usually we are, there are standards for bias-free language. So usually, especially in psychology, there's a lot of advocacy, and so we have typically said person-first language, so a person with paraplegia instead of saying a paraplegic or even a paraplegic person. But something that's important to remember is that some communities say, no, this is not some shameful or difficult disease. This is who I am. And so some communities have embraced identity-first language. So instead of saying a person with autism, many autistic adults prefer the term an autistic person. Now it's tough. No group is homogenous. So that means that there's never a complete agreement on what everyone prefers. So let's say you are doing an interview with someone who's autistic, but they prefer to say a person with autism, you would follow what they prefer. Same thing with pronouns. You, by APA style, you go with the pronoun that the person you're writing about prefers. So you need to, if you're, let's say this is your first time writing about this group, you need to do some research. You need to pay attention to what the journal, what are the articles and books you're reading using, and notice the years, because language shifts over time. So if you notice that your older ones are saying one thing, but the newer ones are saying something else, go with that. Be consistent within your paper. So if even among the newer ones there's some debate, make your best effort and then be consistent with that. So gender diverse people, there's kind of a broadest term that is preferred, transgender and gender nonconforming, and then you can shorten that to TGNC. The page numbers that I give are from this book, so the paperback non-spiral. I imagine that the spiral bound is probably the same page numbers, but it's all in chapter 5, and there's headings. It's fairly easy to navigate. So whatever, I would suggest just kind of at least skimming through that section in general, but particularly if you're writing about a population, look at the guidelines they give. The biggest change to the bias, in my opinion, is that the pronoun they is now formally accepted as a singular gender-free pronoun. So if you're giving an example, like if a student wants to participate, they can contact the researcher by email. That's something that previously has been considered unprofessional, and so often the solution is to phrase it differently. I often will just go back and rewrite it and say, students who want to participate can contact the researcher by email. That actually eliminates the need for a pronoun at all, but when I make it plural, then if I need to refer to them in a follow-up, I can say they, and it would have referred back to plural students. See. So there's different ways that you could work around it. The APA does not like the he/she. It just becomes a little bulky. And they also don't recommend alternating he and she. So using he in one example and she in the next. It's just too easy for bias to slip in. And you can use he or she, but do it only if you have a really good reason, because it does get kind of bulky. This is a big change, and I'm not sure how others are going to use it. So I prefer to stay a little conservative until we see what comes out in journals, kind of what's going to be the standards. And I've checked in with other colleagues, and so far it seems like most people are saying, okay, first see if there's a good way to rewrite it. So don't, in language, we often use they as a singular example. Just like I said up here, if a student wants to participate, they can contact. We use that all the time, and that's fine. That's spoken language. It's informal. It's not a big deal. But in written language, we try to be a little more precise, a little more formal, because that language is all that our reader has to go on. They can't give us a funny look, or we can't, I often use the way my voice goes, my hands, my face. There's a lot that I can do to help get my message across when I'm speaking, even on a video like this where I can't see you and I can't clarify unless you leave a comment. And so when you're writing, you want to be really, really clear and concrete. And there's also sort of formal writing that makes everything as respectful as possible. And so I would say in formal writing, still try other solutions, but sometimes those are really awkward. So if you have a spot where it's hard to rephrase it, it's hard to make it plural, if all else fails, then use they. If you're using it more than 2 or 3 times in a paper, though, a singular they, so they referring to one person, I think that at that point it kind of falls under a style issue where you can clean up your style. This is 2020. Maybe it'll be different in a few years. But for now, I would work on developing habits of how to write using, still sticking with they, mostly as a plural pronoun, unless, as I mentioned before, if it's the pronoun that someone identifies by, use it. It is disrespectful in formal academic writing. I mean, I believe it's disrespectful anyway. But even if you have issue, even if you don't like that, it's important if you're doing formal academic writing to follow the formal academic standards. So you respect whatever pronoun the person you're writing about identifies with. One of the things I like, the publication manual, when they talk about bias, they give a little of the backstory and explain why different terms are concerning. So both Hispanic and Latino excludes some groups. So currently, this Latino with an @ sign, or Latinx has become very popular recently, is considered to be both gender neutral and non-binary. So it covers people regardless of their gender. It's kind of a non-gendered way of talking about that group of people. APA style says if you're writing about a group, try to avoid the term minorities, and I'll read the way they word it. It's usually equated with being less than, oppressed, or deficient in comparison with the majority. So using more neutral terms like people of color or underrepresented groups. And in each of these places, when they say avoid this term, they tell you which terms to use instead. LGBT is considered outdated now. So they suggest a different variety of terms: LGBTQ, LGBTQIA, or LGBTQIA+. I also, when students are writing, I recommend being specific. So if you are specifically writing about trans individuals, it wouldn't be appropriate to use this label because that's not what that is. In many ways, we group several people together because they all face similar sorts of issues. But if you're only talking about if you're only talking about one part of that group, just be specific. There is, let's see, I don't think I have it in here. Another one I noticed is they talked about some concerns with the word Caucasian. I prefer European American because that kind of keeps it parallel with everyone, because when everyone else is African American, Asian American, whatever, if everyone else is a hyphen, although you don't use hyphens in APA style, but if everyone else has this dual identity and then white people just get to be white, that reinforces the idea that white is normal or true American and everyone else is a special type of American. So it kind of puts everyone parallel to say, okay, Americans have this variety of races. It has happened very, very organically. And so we talk about race and nationality together in the U.S. and it avoids Caucasian or white people being separate. It's also, they talk about using terms like white and black and how you handle that, how you decide what terms to use. Let me think for a moment. I think those are all the most important things I wanted to talk about. The manual also talks about what sorts of things need to go into your methods section and other places. But I think those are the highlights of the changes. So if you're in my writing class, for now I'm probably going to move over everything that's an old material, make sure you're using materials marked 7th edition. But for now, when you're looking at sample papers, those are going to be a different edition. So use them for examples of how to write, but really focus on the templates I give you for how to format your paper. All right, thanks for watching. Bye.